Understanding roof framing. So a roof is typically made up of one of two roof structures. It's either a truss roof. So let's discuss the pieces of the truss. So you have the peak, or where the apex of the triangle comes together. You have the top chord, which is on each side, which would be the corresponding part of a rafter if it were a stick built. A plate, which is where the intersections are put together with the metal plate. You have the heel or the bottom chord, and then all of the 2x4s usually in between are webbing. So the bottom chord and the top chord, coupled with webbing, ultimately make up a truss, and those trusses are set usually 16 inches or 24 inches on center across the roof line to create the roof. Now, one of the things that we'll be talking about pretty consistently is the pitch. So a truss or a stick frame will have a pitch, meaning the steepness of the roof. Pitch is ultimately however many inches of drop if you measure 12 inches level out from the center of the roof. So a 412 pitch is less steep than a 612, an 812, or a 1012. The other type of roof is typically a stick-built roof or a framed roof. So here, instead of trusses being put into place, the roof is built on site. So it starts with a ridge board, and that the rafters come up to and tie into the ridge board. You can have a collar beam which ties those in together, and then of course the ceiling joists which run across the bottom. So you've got joists on the bottom and rafters on the top, and you can replace, if any of these were broken, you can replace any of those pieces without having to necessarily take the entire rafter out or the entire truss out. If you have a truss that's damaged, you've got to take the entire truss out. If you have a stick-built roof and you have any of those components that are damaged, you can take those out individually. So let's talk about roof-to-wall connections. So we have the roof-to-wall connections from where either the bottom chord or the rafter ties into the top plate of the exterior wall. The simplest connection is a toe-nailed connection, which is where they just simply nail those into the top plate of the exterior wall. You could have a single wrap depicted here, where it's a single strap that is nailed into the top chord of the exterior wall and the top of the truss. And then of course, a double wrap, the most secure, where you have a strap on each side that will strap the truss or the rafter to the top exterior wall. So earlier we discussed pitch briefly. So again, here's an example of the run and the rise in the pitch. So the rise is how many inches it is if the run is 12 inches out. So if we had a square, and that square were 12 inches from where it touched the roofing area to the end, the rise is is what the pitch is as it relates to 12. So again, in this scenario, the run is always going to be 12, and the rise, in this one it looks like it's probably an 812. It would be 8 inches over 12, or this slope is an 812. So pitch over rise. Here's another example. This one is a 512, showing the 12 inches from the top, and it measures 5 inches to the base. Now you can get levels or pitch gauges that will give you this angle, so you don't have to measure them directly. But again, when we talk about pitch, that's what we're talking about, is something over 12. So 412, 512, 612, etc. So now that you understand the rafters or trusses, we'll get into decking. So roof decking is divided into two primary types. You've got skip or space decking and solid decking. So skip or space decking you see less and less now, but it is where usually 1x or 1x4, 1x6s were used, and there was actually space between the two deckings. Those were designed to allow air to pass through the roofing substrate, but you see less and less of that now, and it's now moving into either solid plywood, OSB, or 1x6 tongue and groove. So, but you still run into sometimes space decking. There's sometimes, check with the law and ordinance provision, there's sometimes that skip decking is no longer to code, and we have to actually replace it with solid decking before we can re-roof the house. Recognize from the photo here with the tongue and groove, sometimes if you have an open truss system on the bottom, you're actually seeing the bottom side of the decking from inside the house. So if you have a puncture or something like that, you actually may need to go in and replace a larger area of that 1x6 tongue and groove. So depending on where the property is, the decking could be connected using hurricane clips. So hurricane clips are where the sheets of plywood come together, or the OSB come together, and they add additional strength, and they provide a little bit of separation between the decking because it expands and contracts. The hurricane clips are used for additional security. Deck nailing will be something that's discussed depending on where the property is located. There are some locations that require decks to be nailed to a 612. Got to be an 8-penny nail, nailed 12 inches. The nails can be no further than 12 inches on center in the center field of the plywood. And then along the edges, the nails can be no more than 6 inches apart from one another. So the decking must be re-nailed to meet this code to a 612. So moving on to secondary water protection. So after the decking goes on, many times you'll have felt, either in 15-pound or 30-pound felt varieties. Sometimes to get 30-pound felt, they'll actually put 2 layers of 15-pound felt on. So felt in many cases is the first thing that goes on top of the decking. In some areas, they actually could tape the joints with secondary water protection, meaning if the shingles blew off, the decking itself is solid because there's no gaps in the decking specifically. Depending on where the home is, again, there could be what's called ice and water shield. Ice and water shield, depending on the code of the area, may need to be in the valleys and along the eaves, and sometimes those could be required up to 2 feet from the interior heated wall. So check with your local code as to how much ice and water shield need be applied. Typically they come in 3-foot rolls. So if you have a 1 foot or an 18-inch overhang, code requires 2 feet from an interior wall, you actually have to apply 6 linear foot of ice and water shield around the perimeter in order to meet code of 2 feet from an exterior roof. And again, this is in the case of to help prevent ice damming.